Hello, welcome here. For those of you that don't know, my name is Lauren. I make vlog style videos predominantly on YouTube, and then on TikTok I make videos predominantly about books, and I do book recommendations. On Instagram I just kind of do whatever I want. Go wherever the wind takes me on Instagram. But I've been wanting to make a video just especially dedicated to books on YouTube for a while, and I wasn't totally sure formatting that I wanted that video to take, and obviously by the title of this video I figured it out. So these are going to be 5 books that I think really define my taste as a reader. Oh, also it was like almost impossible to narrow down the list to just 5 books, so if you're interested I can make a part 2 because there are so many books that could have been included on this list, but here are just going to be 5 I think do a pretty good job of summarizing what I look for in a book and what I enjoy. I read predominantly literary fiction. Occasionally I'll read more experimental fiction or memoirs, but yeah, typically I just lean towards literary fiction. That's kind of my thing. Oh, and I also want to warn you that I will probably include spoilers in this video. I'm not trying to, but I also am just one of those people, I don't care about spoilers. Like, you can spoil an entire book for me and tell me every little detail and I'm still gonna read it. I love when people spoil movies for me, so I'm sorry if I do that. It's just because I don't care about spoilers. You've been warned. Okay, let's do it. The first book that often comes to mind for me when people ask me either my favorite book or a book that really defines my taste as a reader would be Play It As It Lays by Joan Didion. And I think that's really because that book kind of sparked my fascination with literary fiction. I just remember when I first read it, this probably would have been almost 10 years ago, I was really struck by just how contemporary the writing felt despite being written in 1970 or being published in 1970. And this book was also really my introduction to books that kind of lack plot. And I was sort of immediately enthralled by Joan Didion's writing just for that exact reason, because I had no idea that you could write about anything that didn't have a clear plot and clear plot points and characters and setting, and I just didn't know that you could kind of write about the internal lives of women or the everyday goings-on of people. And I think I just find really mundane things about people's life truly fascinating. I would happily read people's grocery lists all day long. I just think that the intricacies of people's everyday lives, and not even the intricacies, like the boring, really mundane things about everyday people's lives, are just really fascinating. Okay, but basically, Play It As It Lays is about this woman. Her name's Maria, and she's an actor, but as she's kind of growing older, I think she's only in her 30s. She's not even old. I may be wrong. She might not be in her 30s. I read the book a long time ago. But basically, her career as an actor is sort of slowing down, and her personal life is beginning to collapse. It becomes very clear to the reader that Maria and her husband are headed towards a divorce, and she starts to engage in really self-destructive behavior. She starts pulling away from the people that she's closest to, and she compulsively drives all over Los Angeles. That's kind of how she spends her days. She also goes to the grocery store and buys amounts of food that could feed an entire family to kind of keep up the appearance that she is living with an entire family and that nothing in her life is amiss. That's a detail of the story that I don't think I'll ever forget. I just found that so fascinating. And it's not just Maria that's kind of engaging in these self-destructive behaviors. It seems like everybody in her life is really just in chaos. The final page of this book, or even just the final paragraph, is one that I will never ever forget. I think about it so often because it's just so startling in its bleakness. And yeah, easily one of my favorite books of all time. It's a book that I recommend to almost everybody. And yeah, it's incredible. I've read almost all of Joan Didion's work. She, as an author, I think really captures my taste as a reader. So yeah, highly recommend Play It As It Lays. Also, A Book of Common Prayer by Joan Didion, and Blue Nights, A Year of Magical Thinking. Like, I just think she can do no wrong. The second book on my list is going to be On Earth We Are Briefly Gorgeous by Ocean Vuong. And this book is written in the form of a letter from a Vietnamese American son to his illiterate mother. And it's kind of obvious that this book is a memoir. The narrator of the story is nicknamed Little Dog, and Little Dog's life mirrors Ocean Vuong's life. Little Dog's mother works in a nail salon. She's a Vietnamese immigrant, and they're living in Hartford, Connecticut. They also live with Little Dog's grandmother. And between the three of them, Little Dog, his mother, and his grandmother, none of them can really speak English. The story basically follows Little Dog's life growing up in the US with his mother, who at times is extremely abusive, but she also suffers from PTSD. It really adds this kind of complex dimension to her abuse. When Little Dog is a teenager, he goes to work on a tobacco farm and begins a relationship with a boy named Trevor. I feel like I can't even say anything more without just giving away the rest of the story, but it's like incredibly devastating and so beautiful. This is a book that I feel made me genuinely so much smarter upon finishing it. I think this book just perfectly encapsulates the way that reading literature by individuals with a lived experience so different from your own is so profoundly informative. Okay, number 3 is going to be Sula by Toni Morrison. It was really difficult to pick which Toni Morrison novel I wanted to include on this list. I knew she was going to be on the list no matter what, but I kind of had to decide between Sula, Beloved, and The Bluest Eye. But I ultimately picked Sula because it was the first of her books that I read, and I think it may have been the one I enjoyed the most. I did really love The Bluest Eye. That book is incredibly difficult, but we're going to talk about Sula. So it's about these two girls named Nell and Sula, and they grew up in this fictional town in Ohio called Medallion. The two girls have this promise that they're going to share everything, but eventually they grow up. Nell ends up getting married, and Sula, soon after Nell's wedding, leaves Medallion and goes on to live kind of a polar opposite life to Nell. She goes off to college, she has relationships with men, and she never gets married. And then 10 years after being gone, she comes back to Medallion. And when Sula returns, the townspeople really strongly dislike her. She doesn't follow conventional expectations of a woman. The book takes place in like the 20s and 30s, and the townspeople start to bond over their shared hatred for Sula, and ultimately their hatred kind of betters the lives of everyone in the town. I think the way that Toni Morrison captures the aftermath and the psychological effects of trauma in this really fragmented way kind of perfectly illustrates exactly the way that trauma impacts the human psyche. And I think maybe in Beloved, you'll notice this a little bit more if you read that book, but the way she articulates trauma and how it's not exactly a linear experience when you're recounting it. It comes back in these really fragmented, invasive, pervasive fragments. It's just so perfectly articulated. She's another author, I think, who will make you smarter upon reading her work. She'll just make you feel so much more well-informed. I can't recommend her writing highly enough. Number 4 is Crying in Hmart by Michelle Zauner. This is her memoir that came out in 2021. I'm such a longtime fan of Michelle Zauner. Even before I got really into Japanese breakfast, I would watch Michelle's Vice videos. She would do those munchies specials where she would talk about growing up Korean American and Korean food, and I just thought she was so cool. I thought the way that she talked about food was so interesting, and she just has the coolest style. So I was incredibly excited when I found out that she was releasing a memoir. And the memoir recounts some of her childhood growing up Korean American with a Korean mother and a white father, and the way that her mother was very loving, but in this kind of, as she describes, distinctly Korean, strict way of parenting. I also love the way that Michelle describes typical American mothers as being, I think she calls them like mommy moms. And they're these really physically affectionate mothers who dote on their children and care about being well liked by their children. And this was kind of something that Michelle longed for as a child and as a teenager. So there was always this strain on their relationship where Michelle was just considered a very rebellious child for kind of behaving like an American child and trying to reject her Korean mother's values. And they just had kind of a tumultuous relationship. When Michelle is an adult and has moved away from home, her mother is diagnosed with cancer, and Michelle goes back to live with her parents and to take care of her mother. And she starts learning how to cook Korean food. Michelle's mother ultimately ends up dying. That's not really a spoiler. Like, I'm pretty sure that's literally on the back of the book. Sorry if you didn't know that. Oops. But yeah, to cope with her grief after losing her mother, Michelle starts cooking Korean food and she starts recording music, and she ends up recording the album Psychopomp. Yeah, it's just this really remarkable memoir about grief and healing through food. And I'm obsessed with food, and my whole family's obsessed with food and talking about food and eating food. And my mom literally finishes eating breakfast, and then even while eating breakfast will say, wow, I wonder what we're gonna have for lunch. So if you love food as much as me and as much as my mom, Mary, you'll love this book. It's also really sad. It's really, really sad, but it's incredible. Okay, finally, the fifth book is gonna be A Complicated Kindness by Miriam Toews, who I feel like I kind of shift through saying that Toni Morrison, Joan Didion, and Miriam Toews are my favorite authors. Miriam Toews might actually be my favorite author because I just think she is so hilarious, and her writing and her humor just really scratch this itch in my brain that I don't think any author can. She also just manages to discuss these really horribly upsetting events in a really humorous way, and also with kind of like a bluntness and a simplicity that's so matter of fact that I think it makes her writing really distinct. And while it can be really simple, it's also so lyrical and mesmerizing. She just writes these sentences that sound so effortless. I think she just is a true genius and just has such a way with words, and I'm just obsessed with her. I can talk about her forever. But yeah, okay, A Complicated Kindness is set in this really small religious town in Manitoba. The town is actually Steinbach, Manitoba, but it has a fictional name in the book. I'm from Manitoba, and I currently live in Manitoba right now. So that might be part of the reason why I love the book so much. I think her sense of humor is kind of distinctly Manitoban a little bit, but I think it can appeal to everybody. The narrator of the book is named, it's either Nomi or Nami. It's spelled Nomi. I think it's Nami. Nami Nickel is her name. She's this 16-year-old girl that's kind of rebellious, and she just has a lot of questions about authority and the small town that she's living in, which is incredibly religious, and her questioning of authority gets her in a lot of trouble. Her dad, Ray, is this really sweet man. He's also just a very dutiful member of the Mennonite church. It's revealed in the book that Nami, her sister, Tash, left their small town 3 years prior to the start of the book because she left the town with her boyfriend. And then Nami's mother also left the town, but under more mysterious circumstances. And the Mennonite town where they live, it has sort of these rules where if you break certain rules, you'll be shunned and no one in the town will speak to you. And so essentially your only option is to leave the town. I think if you grew up at all religious, then you'll find this book incredibly relatable, especially if you were a rebellious child and you questioned authority. And it is just so funny. It's so hilarious. It'll make you want to get drunk in a prairie wheat field and roll around in some hay. What more do I have to tell you? Okay, those are the 5 books. If you have any book recommendations for me based off of those books that I mentioned, I would love for you to leave them in the comments. If you ever have a book recommendation for me, please just comment it on any video. I'm always looking for book recommendations. And yeah, thank you for being here, and I will see you soon, okay? Bye.